In Homeseek, it's the end of the world, or more precisely one lifetime after the end of the world, with nuclear war, famine, and other such disasters being the cause of our problems. The group you play at the start pulled the Fallout approach of hiding underground, hoping for a day when they could return to the surface to reclaim the world. But ultimately, they ran out of supplies and needed to venture forth into the wasteland. Unfortunately, despite the gravity of the well-done opening cinematic, as well as the narrator's dialogue in the intermission segments, the oppressive tone of weighted desperation doesn't really hold up quite as much in the actual gameplay, which almost feels like they're telling an entirely different story due to how the resources and events happen in the game. Maybe this will change after release, but all I can base this on is the provided press copy for this review. Basically, the story that is trying to be told, at least in the first chapter, is your people are trying to find a reliable source of water and food that is not contaminated, while facing off against not only nature, but also the groups of people that wander the wastelands. In the second chapter, it's fairly similar, but we end up as a nomadic group with an odd split between internal factions, some that prefer science, others that prefer nature. These are each fine, taken on their own, and basically results in the game feeling like a pair of post-apocalyptic short stories, each taking a few hours to complete along with their related survival challenges. The weirdness though is when it comes to the actual gameplay. This is because the world almost doesn't fit the story. There's a water shortage, but every map has a proper water source, which is kind of necessary since you start with zero water stored. And your people can drink the contaminated water, or you can use any of your fairly early technologies to clean it up a bit, or even later just make it pure water. Food is a similar situation. You start with berry bushes in every zone and then can build farms that produce food from water. And in the later zones outside of natural events, I never really ran into any major issues with keeping food and water supplied to my people. And this didn't even change much between difficulty levels. It just meant I needed a few less people harvesting the building currency scrap, and instead shift them towards resource generation for my people to consume. The major barriers to survival throughout the entire game ended up being almost entirely those natural events, some which worked with the theme, such as heat waves depleting water from our ramshackled storage system, but we had ways to counter them with research technology and building upgrades. The problem is, in a lot of instances that did not make sense, I was left feeling a bit cheesed by the events rather than feeling like my choices mattered in regard to how they played out. On one map, you have a river that you can get tainted water from to purify. Random heat waves come along one day, and the river completely dries up in a matter of hours, not returning until rain ages later. There was nothing I could have done to stop it at that point, but you live with what you live with. In another situation, we were asked to balance the stress between ourselves and a nearby bandit camp. And no, there's no technology to help against bandits, no weapon systems or such to build up. So it was basically just putting a somewhat convoluted timer on the map, since every few days it would also give you the option of how to deal with the bandits, all of which increased stress and no options for decreasing it, even at a cost. And this continued on, with probably the most awkward one being a mission where we were slowly ferrying our people to a haven across the sea, which meant getting rid of people every few days. This was fine and made thematic sense. What didn't make any bloody sense was the internal tensions in the group. People were fighting over food and water and how much people consumed, causing problems in the camp, even though production was more than 3 times the consumption each day, and everyone could have eaten until they exploded, and we would have still had leftovers in storage. Needless to say, it was very hard to maintain suspension of disbelief during that, and it wasn't helped by a number of oddities and inconsistencies when it comes to selections. One that stands out to me was during the same mission with the ferry, where there was some quarrel that I had honestly zoned out on at the point, since the game kept pressing the anger over supplies for quite a while beforehand, but we were given the choice of punishing an entire group of people or dispelling tensions with a feast. I, having plenty of supplies, chose the feast option. I mean, who doesn't like a party? And it felt like a lighthearted option that should have lowered tensions and taken advantage of our massive surplus of supplies. But no, the game said the camp did not like my heavy-handed approach and gave me a punishment, which made absolutely no bloody sense. That said, the party still happened for whatever good that did. This was oddly a consistent issue throughout the game, with level-to-level mechanics oddly clashing with each other, and while each part of the game is fine and enjoyable to an extent in isolation, it always felt like they were fighting each other narratively, which really plucked me out of it. This was also amplified by how the game handles progression, since on your first playthrough you don't carry progress zone to zone. It's actually a feature you unlock only after beating the first campaign one section at a time. So basically, you don't keep your research, exploration, people, or any other feature from one encounter to the next until you've already beaten the entire first campaign in a piecemeal fashion, which finally unlocks a continuous mode as well as an endless survival challenge on each map, should you want to see how long you'd last without the story kicking you out. This forced separation between them ultimately led me to take less advantage of one of the game's core mechanics, exploration, or basically the way you progress to the victory condition on each of the maps. You simply take people from your camp, send them out with resources, and they send back new story beats, research objectives, people, resources, etc., depending on what you find. But since I didn't get to keep my research between missions until unlocking the continuous mode, it just held zero weight for me to explore the side areas. The exploration option also had a lot more of the weird breaks where options didn't match intent. One I actually ran into a lot was when I was given a choice of using a little scrap to do something versus a lot of scrap to do something, which invariably the little scrap one would cost 100, the lot of scrap one would only cost 50. And even still, I'm not sure which option is the right choice due to oddities in the outcomes generally just going bad for me each time. Now, outside of that oddity, the exploration mechanic is actually fine. You have a handful of areas you can explore, you can research getting a second expedition going as well, and when you completely explore an area, it will unlock others, provided there's a further path from the zone you chose. These provided nice little mini stories sometimes, which were nice to latch onto, and weirdly felt more in line with the gameplay itself than the main story, so it was nice. It was also handy that when an expedition needed your input, the game would auto-pause, so you aren't sitting there trying to catch it on your own. Now, stepping away from all the story and world-building stuff and back into the actual map mechanics, things mostly operated fine. Though in my playthrough, I did encounter a few mechanical bugs and odd quirks that did lead to issues for me, but let's start with the good before that. You have multiple sources of water, mostly giving tainted or salt water depending on what they are. Wells, the most basic, just give you tainted water, but have limited supplies that do refill when it rains though. Rivers give you tainted water as well, but have unlimited supplies unless bandits block them off or you get particularly sunny days, and they do refill with rainwater as well, just a little bit slower. And then you have ocean water, which is undrinkable salt water that requires desalination to use, which is a technology you get later on. To get water from point A to point B requires building pipes, which come in different qualities that control water loss along the way, but they do add up quickly. On the downside, getting water uphill is a royal pain in the butt, since currently, as of the writing of this, in the press access version, the only way to actually get the water uphill is the Archimedes screw, which is a choke point for water types, and has annoying output requirements, and with usually only one, rarely two locations for them on the map, it can mess with your building placements a lot. Now that said, there is another building that says it can send water uphill, but as of this review, it doesn't work, and that is the advanced water storage. If they do end up fixing that, it could make managing water on a lot of maps far less frustrating and taking far less room, and make some of the mechanics a bit easier to handle. Another bug with the advanced buildings though has to do with those advanced distribution centers and the advanced houses, which actually have inlets for food and water, and outlets for waste. For some odd reason in the press copy, if you have food and water in, it won't let you send waste out to a processing plant to reclaim water. This seems like a bug, but time will tell, and it'll probably be a day one fix. Now, sitting opposite to water, food sources are a bit more limited, at least until you get to the second campaign, with berry bushes being your starting limited food and farm technology being your regenerating food. With the second campaign introducing two types of farms, animal and plant, which oddly have to be on their very specific locations. So you cannot run two plant farms and ignore animals, or two animal farms and ignore plants, when a map only has one farm location for each. To make up for it a bit, the animals do add some perks, but frankly I never really bothered much with them outside of just having them as a food source, since it felt like needless complications unless required for mission objectives. This may have been because by the point we get them, which is the second campaign, I had already gotten used to punching through expeditions without them. Now, outside of food and water, it's pretty much just entirely quality of life improvements or processing tools. You have houses to fulfill your people's need for shelter, nothing really happens to them. You have research buildings for improving your technology, though I ended up just not using it nearly as much as I think they wanted me to. You have expedition buildings that let you organize your, well, expeditions. There's also plenty of water processing options. Some use power, some don't, and generally with limited building space and the fact that events will rush you to finish the expedition end of missions due to the weirdness mentioned earlier, bothering to build them up beyond the basics felt pointless. Now, a lot of maps use altitude to offer artificial difficulty to the water management, though really they wouldn't be so bad if that water processing plant and the connection rules worked as written rather than fiddly. Beyond that, the rest of the stuff is optional to engage with usually, with a community center that lets you pass laws that changes work times, whether your people pick up scrap on their way to work or catch water in buckets when it rains. You also have a hospital that lets you treat constant injuries your people get, some making sense, others not so much, but it is handy to have and is weirdly one of the few buildings I bothered researching upgrades to towards the end just to get people in and out quickly, though weirdly some people would live several days with injuries before going in at all. Though when they do go in, you sometimes have to scrounge around the map to see where they disappeared from. Same for that mission where we had to send people off. You kind of just had to scramble around after sending them off to find out where you needed to shuffle people around. But that aside, the list goes on with various support buildings, but for the most part, by the time you're diving too deep, you've run out of room on the map for more buildings, which was oddly enough the bigger barrier to my communities than the actual resources I needed to survive. I personally think if they would have doubled down on the storytelling and made the mechanics match the spirit of the storytelling, it would have been an epic title. On the flip side, if they would have ditched the storytelling and made it focus more on the long-term survival of the community, they would have had a rival to games like Banished. But as it stands, it sits in a weird middle ground where these two aspects are fighting each other. But overall, the game itself, despite all the buts, in spite ofs, and inconsistencies, is fine. The demo will give you a solid feel for what the game is, at least for the first campaign, since if you're thinking of buying it. And the second campaign is just more of that, but with competing factions that also suffer a bit of a but due to how weirdly it's implemented, as more spiteful about the buildings you build rather than balancing act between the two mentalities. And I hate to be negative about it, since it is maybe a 5 or 6 out of 10 game, this title is Traptic's pushing out of its comfort zone, and they really did make major improvements compared to their previous games, and I do think they could turn into a solid indie studio. It's just not quite there yet. Now, if you want to check out some other fun indie games, check out the video on screen now by a studio that has earned its stay for me, and if you enjoy this, be sure to drop a like or even comment a game you'd like to see on the channel. And as always, if you want to see this ad-free, keep an eye on the Patreon, since I release them there publicly without ads after a while of being on here.